Hello everyone, and welcome to the Peter Purves Podcast. You know, before I started podcasting, I contacted a very good friend of mine who provided me with so much valuable information that I'll be forever in his debt. And that's why he's my guest today. He's a man of many talents. Podcaster, multi-award-winning comedian, successful award-winning writer, actor and award-winning comedy club host with an encyclopedic knowledge through his hobby of Doctor Who. He's my very good friend and occasional colleague, Toby Hadoke. Toby, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that generally you're considered the guru of all things Doctor Who. Now, it may be you're not. However, you are very prolific. I want to ask you, where does this passion for Doctor Who come from? How did you first get involved?
Well, I think it was. It sort of filled a vacuum. It's probably quite
a lot of dust. You mean?
It's probably quite a cliched story, Peter. I'm the youngest of four, but there's a bit of a gap between the first three are quite close together, and then there's a 4-year gap before I come along. And then not long after that, when I was about 4, I think my dad vanished. Well, he went off to do some work in Germany and kind of never came back, leaving my mum on her own with 4 kids in the countryside in the middle of nowhere, and she had to do things. She had to battle to keep the house. We didn't have any money. So she had to go back to work, having thought she would be just at home with a brood of kids while her husband was the local GP. So it was a bit of a sad tale at a time when, you know, divorce was not massively common. Yeah, so she had to, it was a bit of a struggle for her. So I had to sort of fill my own time, and we lived in a house full of books. And because I'm the youngest of all, my brothers had the Doctor Who Target novels, you know, just a handful, as probably most kids of their age did. And they were kind of into it, you know, and they used to play it and stuff. So I, you know, to fill the hours, would sort of pore over those. And as you'll know, the thing about Doctor Who is there's a lot of history. So if it piques your interest, there's a lot to find out. And I'm somebody that sort of disappears down rabbit holes. And of course, the rabbit holes that Doctor Who digs are vast and winding, and people disappear about down different ones. You know, some people write extended, you know, try and tie up all the fiction to make it make sense. I was always quite interested in the behind the scenes. I think because what happened was I'd read the books, and it taught me to read because I was a bit young for them, really. So it was my education in a way.
Yeah.
And I learned all sorts of words from Doctor Who books. I credit Terence Dicks with more of my education than perhaps many people. He wrote so many of these books, but also because I wanted to imagine what they were like, and this was before videos and repeats and anything like that, I noticed in the magazines it would sometimes give you cast lists. And so I would, when I was reading the book, I'd look at who the actors were in the magazine so I could imagine what the characters looked like. But that meant I would watch television and spot actors. That's why I have this ridiculous memory for actors. I could give you the name of any actor that's ever been in any classic series episode of Doctor Who, and probably their CV as well, because I was committing that stuff to memory. There was no Wikipedia in those days. If you wanted to know something, you had to remember it. And so that took up an awful lot of my sort of brain space, and I went down that rabbit hole, and I've still never emerged from it.
Well, it is quite remarkable. I was going to ask you about how you remembered all these things, and that gives me some insight into your actual understanding of things. But your knowledge, I mean, my knowledge of Doctor Who is minimal. I was in the show, and after 3 or 4 years after I was in the show, I stopped watching it. I only saw it very occasionally, just keeping up to date with who was in it and so on. And then, of course, in 1989, when it all ceased, and didn't really come back until the Americans got interested with the Paul McGann
That's right.
bill.
Yeah.
And then, what was it, 2004, Christopher Eccleston?
Yeah, well, that's what he was. It started in March 2005, but yeah, they were making it again in 2004. Yeah.
And then it's gone from, well, strength to strength in terms of the amount of money that's spent on it. I mean, it's absolutely massive now. I don't think it's improved. I'm very much stuck back in the old days. As I say, my knowledge is minimal. Yours is extensive, and it runs the whole gamut right the way through.
Yes, but as as somebody who's considers himself an actor, a writer, a comedian, the Doctor Who thing, I have to sort of, well, I stress for my own self-regard, I think, is very much, it was always an amateur thing. I was never wanted to be, in inverted commas, a professional fan. I don't consider myself a journalist or a researcher. It's just that the way I do things for my own pleasure is perhaps to an extent that is unhealthy. And so it was never something that I ever thought would be anything other than my hobby. I just did my hobby hard. And it was only when Doctor Who came back, and I was already established as a stand-up on the circuit, and I started to talk about it as just because I'm an MC at a club, so you talk about what's going on that week. That suddenly I realised I could combine the two things, but I'd never been part of active fandom. I didn't have friends who were Doctor Who fans. I was not part of any network whatsoever. It was simply a kid whose mum didn't have time to do as much as she might have wanted to do. Also one who lived in the countryside who was slightly immune. I'm not now, but then to the joys of going outside and getting wet and muddy and things like that. So I stayed inside and I read and I pored over these books and things and also, wrote my own fictional stories, played. I did a lot of playing where I pretended to be in Doctor Who, but also, as I say, that sort of researching, trying to soak up every piece of information that I could about the past, because you couldn't watch the shows in those days. So the only way you could experience them was sort of vicariously through archaeology.
Did you ever play a part in Doctor Who? Have you ever been cast in it?
Peter, I have done everything but.
I mean, that really is remarkable.
I've done some big finishes. I've done plenty of sort of audio adventures, and they've given me some lovely parts, and I've worked with every classic Doctor, so I've got those notches off the. I've come close, but no, to actually be in the series. I don't know if you know the wonderful actor Jeffrey Whitehead, who I did.
Yes.
I did a radio classic serial with him, and we were talking about Doctor Who, and his brother-in-law is Philip Hinchcliffe, who produced Doctor Who in the Tom. And for some reason Doctor Who came up. Oh, it's because he'd worked with William Hartnell, and then he said the same question. He said, you must have been in it then? And I said, no, I haven't. And he went, God, you'd have thought they'd have thrown you a bone by now. And I thought, well, if Jeffrey Whitehead thinks so, I think that's acceptable. Yeah, no, I've done everything but very much always the bridesmaid.
You've been very dominant, however, in the background to Doctor Who. You've got a wonderful relationship with Chris Chapman, the director. And in fact, we've worked together, I think, on 3 background pieces, which were great fun. You came to my house, which was infested with Chumblies from Galaxy 4. Your research on that, I remember at the time thinking, was quite remarkable. You got everything right. And my memory is very faulty. My memory is only partially through people like you bringing up things. I think, oh yeah, that happened, but I don't remember them on my own. Yeah. They come through. Your research is immaculate. How do you go about it?
Well, you see, again, this came from being a fan who was buying the DVDs, and I would hear so I got in through doing the commentaries, which listeners might not know is when cast and crew sort of talk over the pictures. You could watch the episodes with the cast and crew, and they decided fairly early on that it would be useful sometimes to have somebody to moderate those in order to do the things you said, to say, oh, this is Studio TC8, or do you remember this actor? You worked with him on that, blah, blah. And I used to get annoyed if, and I've listened to lots of DVD commentaries, not just on Doctor Who, and I always would get a bit annoyed if the participants had a question that then wasn't answered, or the participants start sort of talking around something and getting it wrong and spending ages doing it. And I'm always going, no, I'm shouting at the telly. So then when I was asked to do one, I thought, well, don't be in that position where they're going to ask you a question and you don't know the answer. Now, things like the actors I sort of knew anyway, but I tried to anticipate questions that I might need to, like, which studio was this, for example. And I learnt sometimes which pieces of information I should try and have in my head. So it's a mixture of stuff that I already know because it's there, because I learnt it when I was 12, and that stuff stays in the way that what I was doing last week doesn't. But also, it's out of respect for the fact that Doctor Who has been very fortunate that people like yourself have been so willing to open up and participate in things like this. The very least I can do is come prepared, and also there's a little bit of ego there. I don't want there to be a moment in a DVD commentary where somebody says, what's that, Toby? And I go, oh, I don't know. That's going to be a bad listening experience. And also, that what Doctor Who fans are like. That's the other thing. What even if you get something right, if you phrase it in a way that they could infer that you've got it wrong, they will let you know. They'll never give you the benefit of the doubt.
I think I'm quite lucky in that my memory is of long gone Doctor Who, so many years ago. There are so few people who would remember, even if they had done the research, whether I'm right or wrong. So most of what I say doesn't get disputed.
No, you're very good, Peter. In fact, I was having a discussion with a colleague the other day who'd emailed me about a former colleague of yours, actually, who was a script editor, who said, I've just gone through a load of interviews with him, and almost everything he says is utter nonsense. And there is an element of that where you have to go, oh, we'll just quietly remove that bit, or we'll just, cover it with I sometimes have to find ways of diplomatically going, oh, really? But on the other hand, what it says here is, but you don't have to do that with you, Peter. You're a pro. You know what you're doing. Sometimes diplomacy is the order of the day.
I'm a very good dissembler.
You still got it.
Tell me, where does your real affection lie? And I mean, mine really does lie with William Hartnell. I appeared with him. He was the first Doctor. I always say at various conventions and various signings, when people ask me, I always say, well, without Bill Hartnell, none of this would have happened. The extended family that has become Doctor Who. Bill was a definitive Doctor. And I'm not saying the people that followed weren't as good or better or anything else. It's not a comparative thing. He created something quite remarkable, which had the longevity. It ran from 1963 until 1989 as a continuous regular serial on the BBC before it finally died. That was a terrific run. Now, I know it's come back, and to me, it bears no resemblance to the original of what Doctor Who was. And I think that original element of Doctor Who has been totally lost. What do you think?
Interesting. Now, you see, I sort of love it all. I mean, I'm biased because I think Doctor Who has, well, to say it saved my life is a bit dramatic, because it's not like it ever pulled me back from the brink of anything, but it's been such an important part of my life. I can't imagine my life without it. I think about it every day. I've now got friendship groups that have been provoked as a result of it. But when I was a very lonely kid, it provided me with such, not just solace, because that suggests it's a comfort, which it is, but also zeal. It made me want to learn things and want to know things, and the excitement of a new episode, or learning of an old episode, or even finding a photograph or discovering what an actor looked like. So but it's also, I'm not, tunnel visioned. It's made me interested in Shakespeare and all sorts of other things. So I love it all. And the beauty of it is, I always think as well, is that it has survived, but it survived through change. So therefore, no matter what mood I'm in, there's a Doctor Who story to suit it. And I go through periods of, having a real feel for a particular era of the show, and I'll watch a few of those. I go, I've done a few of those there, so now I'll watch a bit of Hartnell, or no, I'll watch a bit of John Nathan Turner late 80s stuff. So, and even stories that I didn't like as a kid, because also the thing about loving something is, and you'll know this from Doctor Who fans, part of the joy of loving something is talking about the bits you don't like. And Doctor Who fans like nothing more than making a list of things, a list of grievances about the thing that they're supposed to adore. But unlike you, I do love the new show. I have never been happier than when the show came back. and it was as good, better than I imagined. I still thought it had the spirit of the show, which it might easily not have done. It was still faithful. It carried on the continuity and all those sorts of things that it might, they could have just started again. They could have ignored everything that had gone before. And I thought Russell T Davies did a brilliant job. And I went in with my friend to Toys R Us, and we both got kids who were, younger than that, 6 or 7 maybe. And the Doctor Who theme blared out from this corner, and there was a whole sort of aisle, not even more than an aisle, a whole section that was all Doctor Who, and these two kids ran towards it gleefully. And I looked at my mate, because we'd both grown up when Doctor Who was, had been taken off the air, and it was a bit of a joke. The BBC treated it very shoddily. The media always looked back on it with a certain sort of lofty disdain that was unjustified. So we felt quite hard done by it. So to see those kids do that, we looked at each other and went, this is heaven. We would not have believed this would happen, and so I've really enjoyed the new series. It saddens me now that the discourse around it seems to have soured somewhat, but we're not great with success in this country, and it's been going for 20 years, and the TV landscape is fracturing. The national conversation is toxic, and poor old Doctor Who's got a bit caught in the crossfire. But I still think there is a place for a show that is imaginative and that allows you to write the kind of stories you don't get in any other sort of long-running drama. You can't do that with Casualty or EastEnders or Coronation Street.
No, that's quite right. And I do agree with you that when it first came back with Christopher Eccleston, I did watch the whole series with him, and I thought in fact I was very sad when he left it after that first series, because I thought he was so excellent. I lost interest gradually after that, and I mean, now it looks magnificent. I've got to say, I can't think of anything that is more spectacular. It's quite interesting, when I was in Doctor Who back in 1965, Star Trek came along. And Star Trek was, we thought, well, that's the end of Doctor Who, because the money that was obviously on screen there, we couldn't compete in any way. I mean, there was no budget for our serial, our little tiny domestic serial that wasn't going really anywhere. But it did build up that audience base. But I do agree with you. The Christopher Eccleston return was magnificent. And I thought that was splendid for the future. Well, so it's proved. It is still running. Going back to my era in it, do you mind talking about a couple of the serials there? Because the one that causes the most, I won't say most controversy, it is really the one that people argue most about, saying they like or dislike, and that was the Gunfighters. Yeah. I absolutely loved the Gunfighters. It was Peter Purves having a really good time pretending to be Roy Rogers. Yeah. It had nothing to do with Stephen Taylor, the character who I was supposed to be playing. I mean, I was just giving my head to be silly, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But it was a cracking piece, and Rex Tucker made it filmic. It looked, when you see it now, even the people that don't like it mainly because of the recurring song that kept on going, the theme tune that ran through it. But that was very typical of Westerns at that time that were made. They always had a theme which kept on linking the scenes. It's just that this one, and people do tend to binge watch the old version, and of course the whole thing exists, which is a rarity for any of my pieces on Doctor Who. And I think the tune probably does get a bit irritating, but I think it's a smashing serial.
It's a really interesting example of how we, as a sort of aficionados, digest Doctor Who. Because when I was a kid, obviously, I had no conception that any Doctor Who story could be bad. I loved Doctor Who. It was magic. And then I got this book, and I turned from boy to fan on the 20th anniversary of Doctor Who in 1983, when 2 publications came out: a Radio Times 20th anniversary special and a book called Doctor Who: A Celebration by Peter Haining. And it had a whole chapter in it where it went through all of the stories, written by a venerable fan called Jeremy Bentham, who's a very articulate, smart man. But Jeremy the thing about the Gunfighters is that people might not know is it's actually a spoof western. It's quite some of the spoofery is quite well disguised, and some of the spoofery I think sometimes gets mistaken for bad television. But it does have some bad television in it. Not the filming. The film cameraman that Rex Tucker had at his disposal was Ken Westbury, who shot The Singing Detective. So was a really experienced film cameraman, and he makes it look fantastic. And Barry Newbury's sets are phenomenal for considering it's a television studio. But some of the, I think, aside from the likes of John Alderson, who actually worked in the States on Westerns, who's playing Wyatt Earp, and Anthony Jacobs, who was a big voice man anyway, so they can handle it, and Shane Rimmer, who was Canadian. A few of the Clanton brothers seem to have come from a part of America that no one's been to before or since. So it's not flawless, but I think some of it's flawed. I think, seeing as it is inherently a funny show, and I think the fact that Doctor Who has a sense of humour is one of the things that enables it to survive. I'm not sure the audience at the time were necessarily quite ready for where Donald Cotton, the very sort of funny wordplay, you can imagine him chuckling to himself as he's writing it. And I'm not sure that all of that comes out. It's perhaps more obvious in his previous script called The Mythmakers, which is an obvious sort of spoof of the Iliad and the Odyssey and things like that. And he's sort of dismantling the mythologizing of ancient figures. But anyway, yeah. So the Gunfighters, I think Doctor Who fans didn't like it because when they were younger, they didn't get it. But that means we then inherited that thing, and it just goes to show how if the conversation is quite down on something, that becomes the truth. Because for years, because the Gunfighters has never quite recovered from being called, as it was back in the day, the worst Doctor Who story of all time. There was also a bit of a myth that it had got the lowest viewing figures, which sort of looked to act as evidence for what was a very personal assertion that this is the worst Doctor Who story of all time. But it's never quite escaped that stigma. But of course, and now my reaction to it might be based on the fact that, well, I don't like to be seen to be the one that goes along with the crowd. So when I watched the Gunfighters, I was like, well, I actually think it's brilliant and unappreciated, because that's how I get my kicks, being able to say, well, yeah, I'm not the same as everybody else. And I suspect the truth is somewhere in between. I think it's great fun. It probably isn't as funny as I like to think it is, because I want to get behind it.
No, I'm probably wrong in that respect as well.
But I think it's certainly not the worst Doctor Who story of all time. It's certainly, I think, is misunderstood because it's not supposed to be a straight Western. And some of its elements, I think it's sort of tonally askew. It doesn't quite know how to pitch itself, but I think it's a hoot, and it's a very, very handsome production, and it's got some fine actors in it,
It was great fun to do, I have to say. And as I say, Rex Tucker, he didn't tell me not to do the silly things. I tripped over my spurs and I dropped
you're very funny.
He just let me do it. If I wanted to be silly, then that was fine. And of course, I do have to sing the song, which I do think my double take to one of the Clantons standing beside me with a gun as I'm singing is really quite
very
good.
Funny.
I thought that was spot on.
Let's hope the piano knows it. Yeah, and one of the episodes is called "Don't Shoot the Pianist," which is very funny. It's a good laugh, the Gunfighters, and I'm glad that it exists.
You mentioned the Mythmakers in all that. Now, we did a follow-up with Maureen O'Brien, and you and Chris Chapman made it. We had a wonderful time when we had the entire British Museum to ourselves for several hours in the evening, which was, well, an absolute treat, as well as being a very nice piece of work.
I don't know if we're allowed to talk about that, because we've banked this documentary for a future release, but it's not been scheduled yet. So I don't know if that's a secret or not. But
let's talk a little bit about your involvement with Chris Chapman, because you have done some extraordinary things, which has required a huge amount of work on your part to get the actual research together. Tell me about those experiences.
Well, I mentioned I was never part of Doctor Who fandom. It was always a very private passion. But I did this show in Edinburgh called Moths Ate My Doctor Who Scarf, which was a stand-up show about Doctor Who. And as a result of that, it was very successful. And somebody who worked on DVD range, and you know, I was just a purchaser of the DVDs. It was part of my hobby. Suggested me to moderate one of these DVD commentaries, which I did on a couple of William Hartnell stories with the director Christopher Barry and William Russell and a couple of, and I did that the night that I opened at the West End. So it was such a Doctor Who-y day. I was opening my Doctor Who show at the West End and sitting with the people who made it in the 1960s, doing this thing that I'd always dreamed. Some people practice their Oscar speeches. I used to practice moderating Doctor Who DVDs because I thought I could do it, but thought that I'd never get the chance because nobody knew me from Adam, and why would they? There are so many fan experts out there. But I think because I'd, you know, proved on stage I could walk and talk in a straight line and regurgitate facts at the same time, because part of the joke of the show was, you know, to illustrate what a nerk I was, and I wasn't just some comedian who was jumping on the bandwagon because Doctor Who was successful again. And you can get a laugh from reading off facts off the top of your head. It's just a little bit of a showpiece. So it was obvious that I knew what I was talking about. So and lots of Doctor Who people sort of came to see that show just because it was about Doctor Who. And so, yeah, I was suggested to do this, and I clearly did an okay job because I've done millions of them now. But then as a result of that, a couple of the producers maybe had the idea that I could do some presenting. And Chris, I didn't know at all, but I think he liked something I'd done, and he just suggested a meetup. And we gradually started making documentaries together, and they used to be sort of specialist ones where I'd spend the weekend with a Doctor Who actor, or we'd look for a particular thing, you know, there'd be a bit of archaeology to it. But then he started to have a presenter on the making ofs, which can quite often just be people sitting in front of a green screen and cutting from one talking head to another. But Chris is a bit more artful than that. He doesn't get any more money than anybody else, but he pushes it, and he always gets a good cameraman, and he's always got a very good editor, and he's always got a vision of what he wants to do. And I don't really like gimmicky documentaries, so I don't want them to sound like that, because they're not. They're always about getting to the heart of the story, but he always makes them sort of flow and have a little bit of quirkiness about them. So yes, we took a Chumbly to your house and filmed around Galaxy 4. And so what he does is he sort of trusts me. He'll send me the sort of story that he wants to tell, the sort of order that he has in his head, but he's not prescriptive, and he's, you know, changed depending on what happens on the day. And so I come, and I think, you know, the one we did with Galaxy 4, it wasn't just, oh, you're going to turn up with a load of questions. I've got the sound effects, didn't I? I think I played the sound effects to you and Brian Hodgson, and I showed you some pictures. So then there's a bit of an aid memoir. There's a bit of something to give the audience a little bit of a different, you know, to provoke a different synapse, if you like. And so I credit Chris an awful lot with his vision and his hard work. He's very clumsy, but he's an excellent filmmaker, and he seems to like what I do, and I don't question that. I never, when he rings up, I don't go, "Are you sure you don't want to use somebody else?" I just go, "Right, well, got away with it again," and we've had a very fruitful series of collaborations. Yeah.
I've got to say, everyone that I've seen, I've thoroughly enjoyed, and I do love your style. It's relaxed and it's easy, and it's just like talking to you here now. There's no difference when you get out there doing those things. Certainly, it wasn't in my case when I have done pieces with you. It's just terribly straightforward and simple. It's lovely.
I feel a sort of responsibility for my charges in a way. Do you know what I mean? I mean, again, not you, because you know what you're doing, but sometimes there are people who say, you know, I don't remember anything, and they get a bit nervous, and so it's my job, while Chris is doing all the setting up of the cameras, to kind of relax people off camera as well. And sometimes we're dealing with people who are talking about a loved one that they've lost, for example, and so there's a bit of diplomacy around it, but you know, that's all part of the job, and that's what stops me getting nervous in a way. A bit like when I'm an MC at a comedy club, I quite like hiding behind a job, which then stops me getting self-conscious about my nerves. So I don't worry about being funny when I'm an MC at a comedy club, because I know I've got to tell them when the breaks are. I've got to tell them not to talk. I've got to tell them to turn their mobile phones off. Now, the fact is, in between all of that stuff, I'm telling jokes and being funny and getting laughs, but I'm not worrying about that because I'm hiding behind the job. And it's a bit like that when I'm presenting something. I'm sort of less worried about what I'm doing because I'm conscious of the job. And that's a really good way of overcoming your nerves and perhaps appearing as relaxed as you say that I might do, even though I might be pedaling underneath. But it's more about having your eye on something else that distracts you from your nerves, if you like.
Now, you very self-effacingly say that nobody knows you, but you're an incredibly popular guest at signings and conventions. How did that all start?
Well, again, it was all through this one-man show, Moths Ain't My Doctor Who Scarf, before which, I was very much just a jobbing comic on the circuit. I'd got a good reputation in Manchester because I ran a very good comedy club that's still going, and I'd built up a little sort of fiefdom there, but also was regularly working. I could gig every night back in the day, so I was kind of in the swing of that, and then doing this Doctor Who show. I took it to Edinburgh. I'm sure we'll talk about that because it's a big turning point in my life and career when I finally decided to sort of come out of the closet, as it were, and do this hour-long Edinburgh show about Doctor Who. And that's how I then became on the radar of the Doctor Who people and started doing these things. Initially, I was asked to events to do the show. I would be the evening entertainment, and I had this show because I was touring it at the time. I toured it for 3 years all over the world, and had a run at the West End, and so it was no effort for me to go to a Doctor Who convention, and also because it meant and then I'd be in the green room with Doctor Who. It was very, and people like yourself would see it. I think you saw it one of the shows at Timelash. Yeah,
I did Timelash in Frankfurt.
Yeah. So and I did it in the States and everywhere. So, the attraction was because I've liked to have been at a Doctor Who convention. I didn't do that many as a fan, actually. I mean, we never had any money, so I could never do any of those things anyway, really. I only got the magazine when I could afford it, or if a nice relative came round and dropped one off or whatever. We were the beneficiaries of people's generosity a lot, because people like my mum's work colleagues would know that I liked Doctor Who. Remember, B Sky B did a weekend of Doctor Who. We couldn't afford any of those channels or anything, but her colleague knew I was a big Doctor Who fan, so taped the whole thing for me and gave me 12 videotapes with all, and they showed about 12 different black and white stories, and she taped them all and dropped them off. So people were very kind, and I think people knew it was an easy route to my heart, that if they saw a dinky TARDIS at a car boot sale for 10p, they'd buy it and give it to my mum, and she'd give it to me. So yes, so I've sort of digressed really, but that's why I was happy to do all of that stuff, because I hadn't really done it as a kid. I'd never been really a part of organised fandom. I had a brief dalliance with a local group in Wolverhampton when I was a teenager, but not for a very long time. It opened up a whole new world, personally, because I suddenly had mates who were Doctor Who fans, which I'd not really had. I had one friend who was a Doctor Who fan. I still consider it my hobby. When Chris asks me to do a documentary, I don't consider it the same as if I'm doing an episode of Alan Partridge or if I'm doing an episode of Ridley or whatever. That's work, whereas the Doctor Who thing is sort of something I'm getting away with and kind of get paid for sometimes as well.
Well, the BBC's been heavily involved with Doctor Who continuously, and then had this fairly recent dalliance with Disney, who seem to take it over and who've now moved out. Where do you see Doctor Who going now?
I honestly don't know. I mean, the BBC have an odd relationship with Doctor Who. I mean, as I say, a lot of my formative years, Doctor Who wasn't on, and not only was it not on, it had been ripped rather unfairly from the schedules, because when it finished, it was actually undergoing something of a renaissance, and some of the last couple of years have some excellent stories, but it had no support from the BBC whatsoever. They would also disparage it. It became a shorthand for naff television, and I think if you can run for 26 years and create catchphrases and culture and iconography and recognizable things that are embedded in the public consciousness, perhaps you're slightly better than you're being portrayed. It didn't run for that long by mistake. So the BBC have this habit of sort of knocking things that people like, and getting rid of things that people like, or trying to make something appeal to the audience that don't watch it at the expense of the audience that do. I mean, they seem to do that with everything, which I've never quite understood.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because they started off not wanting Doctor Who. They didn't like it. Right at the beginning, they didn't like it. Before they'd seen it, they didn't like it.
I think they've never quite understood what they have. I mean, I believe very firmly in a public service broadcaster, and I think, without a public service broadcaster, Doctor Who might not have existed, because it doesn't sound like a very commercial idea. It's this weird alchemy. It shouldn't work. Sci-fi is kind of culty, and yet it's this mainstream success. It's not a comedy, and yet without its sense of humor, it would be lost. But it doesn't really. A lot of people say, the thing about Doctor Who is, it was the special effects were so bad, and it kind of was tongue in cheek. And you go, no, it wasn't. The key to it was that it didn't really take the mickey out of itself.
You mentioned your being invited to conventions to perform your show, which had been a success in Edinburgh. Tell me more about it. I know I have seen it, but the people who are listening to this podcast won't have. Perhaps.
No, and it did literally change the course of my life. I'd been a stand-up, and I was doing well. I was doing as well as I ever could have had any ambition to do, because I never thought I was a natural comic. I've exceeded my expectations with that. But I certainly never thought I was the sort of comic to play the Comedy Store. I did, and became a regular. I certainly never thought I was the sort of comic to take a show to Edinburgh. But you can appreciate the Edinburgh Fringe vicariously now through the internet. There's a comedy website called Chortle, and you can see what everybody's up to, and your friends on Facebook. And I had a new material night at the Comedy Store, and acts like Alan Carr and Jason Manford were coming and trying out their new material at it, and then going to Edinburgh. So then I'd keep an eye on them. And they all did all the acts that came through that night. So the ones that worked hard, the ones that tried their new material out and honed it, overnight successes are as a result of loads of really, really hard work. You see some of the comics on the telly and go, well, why did they get on? And lots of other jobbing club comics, because there's loads of brilliant comics in the clubs who don't get anywhere near telly. Well, for people like Alan, people like Jason, Sarah Millican, the hardest working person I know, as well as being a naturally funny person. Love Sarah. She's brilliant. And oh my God, she works, and she takes it very seriously. They all, worked on their Edinburgh shows in advance. So I was aware of people going to Edinburgh and doing these shows, and I thought, well, yeah, but they're a cut above me. I'm just a 20-minute slot at comedy clubs and MC. But I started to get the appetite for it, because I saw people doing well and enjoying themselves. And I thought, well, if nothing else, it will make me better if I just do a show. And every comic seems to go to Edinburgh. And my good friend Mark, I was at a barbecue, and and this is what, so that was in the back of my head. But also a real life tragedy happened, in that I was going through my stuff. And as a kid, I had knitted with the help of my mum, because in the end it was just me and her on cold winter nights watching one of the 3 channels. And I knitted a Doctor Who scarf, because my nan had owned a wool shop. So our house was full of sort of bits of wool. So it was a Doctor Who scarf is the perfect thing to use to make those. And mum suggested it, and she showed me how to go. So I knitted a Doctor Who scarf mum sort of did the donkey work, really. So I had this Doctor Who scarf made of wool, very nice wool. And I was going through a box, having now I was in a relationship, I'd got a kid and all this sort of thing. And I opened this box, and in there was my Doctor Who scarf, and it had been destroyed. Moths had eaten it. And I thought moths ate my Doctor Who scarf was a fine, a perfect bittersweet example of what life does to us. Because Doctor Who had been my unspoiled childhood enthusiasm, that now I was whatever I was, 28-year-old, riddled with psoriasis. I was very poorly, and that affected my mood, and I probably drank too much, and my relationship wasn't great, and so it seemed to me that life was there encapsulated in these raggedy ends of wool. So I said to my friend Mark at this barbecue, he said, he's one of these Adele boy sort of types. He said, Toby, you should write a book. I've got a system where you can write a book in 14 days and make it a bestseller. And I'm like, yeah, I've heard this before. This is why you still work for a skip company. But he's a good guy. He was, and I said, I've got a title, actually. I've got a title called, I said, don't you think this sums up life? Moths ate my Doctor Who scarf. And he said, do that as an Edinburgh show. And I said, I can't afford to do that. I've got a young family. I'm just making ends meet. And he said, and I've taken a piss out of his skip company that he sort of partially owned, I think. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll sponsor you. So I'll pay for your posters and if I can just have my logo on it. And because he'd been an actor and a comic, but was now being sensible and earning money. And he said, let me direct it. So he got his he reconnected with his artistic side,
Yes.
directing me, took the financial pressure off me a little bit, and I took it to Edinburgh. And I'd originally conceived it as a very Doctor Who-y show. It was time traveling. It was in 4 episodes. Some episodes were set chronologically before others, so jokes worked backwards. It was really clever. And as we did the previews, we realised that didn't help, because jokes just need to be funny and easy to digest. And so when I say he directed me, he didn't say stand there and say it like that. He was a sort of objective eye, and he said, don't swear in it like you normally do with stand-up, because it's a show that is about your childhood. It sounds wrong. He said, don't do it in this convoluted order. And he actually said, and actually take out any jokes that are just about Doctor Who that don't reflect on your life, because there was loads of different things in it, because I was trying everything. But the bits that chimed with the audience were the bits about me feeling left out at school, having an absent father, going from one school to another and not quite fitting in at either, then having my own. And so we completely streamlined it. It became the story of me, somebody whose dad left when I was 4 and had this big hole that was filled by Doctor Who. And then by the end of the piece, I've got my own son, and Doctor Who comes back. And when Doctor Who comes back, he sits and watches it with me on the telly. And that was the sort of journey of but it's a stand-up piece, so it's got lots of jokes, it's got lots of illustrations of my nerky geeky brain that are just funny whether you know it or not, but also it was written in a way that if you didn't know anything about Doctor Who, and this hadn't necessarily been my plan, you could still like it. And so what happened was, people came to Edinburgh, Doctor Who fans came and laughed and loved it, but people would come with their friend who was a Doctor Who fan. Parents would come with their kids who was a Doctor Who fan, and the parents would wait afterwards and say, look, I don't even like Doctor Who, but my dad left when I was 4, or I never fitted in at school. So suddenly I had this show that spoke to people about loneliness and childhood and not fitting in and, thwarted ambitions and all that sort of stuff that's sort of unconsciously in the show, that was really about that was supposed to be about Doctor Who, but kind of wasn't. So that's why it did well. That's why they asked to have it back at Edinburgh the following year, where it sold out and got 100% 5-star reviews. It went to the West End. I got a BBC radio series about it, and that's when the Doctor Who people sort of discovered me. And so then I had this working life as an actor, a voiceover man, a stand-up comedian, but also somebody that did the Doctor Who stuff as well. And it's changed my life, yeah.
Isn't it interesting that good comedy is only about truth?
Yes, very much so.
It has to be believable. It's not just someone saying... Comedy has changed. I mean, let's take an example. Les Dawson. Les did jokes. He told funny things, but they were based in a sort of Norman Evans-y kind of world over the garden wall, which is probably before your time, but it's very much North Country comedy from the old music hall and variety days. Comedy has changed totally. It's now all about experiences.
I think the pendulum swings, and one of the reasons Peter Kay was so successful was because that sort of seemingly uncomplicated, dry, earthy, gag-based wit had been absent, because people were trying to be Ben Elton and Bill Hicks and being political and shaking their fists. And then this very charismatic northerner just comes on and does the kind of things you thought you sort of remembered comedy was like, and suddenly it seems like the freshest thing ever. So I think nature abhors a vacuum, and I think tastes change, and the pendulum swings back and forth. At the moment, there is very much the autobiographical thing, but it still has to be identifiable. But again, things are changing, because it used to be that you'd go to a comedy club and there'd be 4 acts on, but now there are different sorts of comedy clubs, or people go and see the one particular person that they like, and so things are changing again. So I think it might be difficult to be a comedy star very soon, but there will be lots of people who've got loyal followings.
Indeed.
Without necessarily, filling the Albert Hall or whatever.
Well, I can honestly say I hope anyone listening to this who hasn't seen you and gets the opportunity to see your stand-up, they should do it. I loved it when I saw it in Germany. I thought you were absolutely terrific, and that was my first experience of you as a comedian. I've never been to a comedy club. I will come to yours when I come to Manchester.
That'd be brilliant.
But I don't know when I'm going to come to Manchester. I might get invited up there. I hope we may meet again at some signing or convention. We did one in Bristol recently where we worked
lovely.
together on a team with Wendy Padbury.
Yes.
That was fun. I really enjoyed that.
Those conventions are run by some chaps called Phantom Films, and a lot of conventioning these days is quite soulless. I think it's people sitting behind a trestle table, signing photos on a sort of factory line. The Phantom Boys, who are wonderful and fun and camp, have a sort of evening cabaret where anything goes, and they get. If you're game like you and like Sophie Aldred and like Wendy Padbury, and it's just a hoot, and it breaks down some of the barriers because those fans all are, they can see the whites of our eyeballs, and it's lovely and unpretentious and a real example of how to do it properly. I think I love those events, so I always say yes, and it's always nice because then I know there'll be people like yourself and Wendy, and we had a lovely drink afterwards, didn't we? And it's just fabulous.
Yeah, and it's so lovely to you're going to have a full house.
Yeah,
and it's and they're all on your side. They want to laugh, they want it to be funny, and you don't have to try very hard. I mean, our ad libs worked.
Yeah, you were fantastic as we do a Hammer horror spoof. You were, you just have to throw yourself into it because the audience are on your side,
Absolutely.
So I think it emboldens you to just take a punt and have a laugh. And no, it's great. I really enjoy those events. I hadn't done any for a while, so it was nice to dip my toes back in.
Absolutely.
They're good fun.
Look, it's been an absolute joy, as usual, chatting to you, and I always love meeting you. I think we should do it again because you've hinted at so many other things that you do. I'm not a fan of anything very much, but I'm very much a fan of yours, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks ever so much for joining me.
You flatter me, Peter. Bless you. Thanks for having me.
More from Toby about acting, comedy writing and so much more in the new year. But there is a bonus pod coming on December the 23rd. It's a diary of the short tour I made, starring with my mate Colin Baker, of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, the ups and downs of a small theatre tour, an English road trip if you like, in time to wish you all a happy Christmas. Till then, adieu.